Welcome to the Myrna Method live stream. I'm registered dietitian Myrna Haig, and my goal is to bring you impactful nutrition information that can significantly change your life. What we're going to talk about in this video is skinny fat. Now, a lot of people associate obesity with a lot of chronic illnesses. In fact, it's associated with most diseases. And when we think of type 2 diabetes, a lot of times we think of people that are overweight. I mean, they're visually overweight. But what we don't realize is that type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, has more to do with fat, and this can affect somebody at their ideal body weight. So Sam, if you'll switch me over, let's take it into the video and let's see what we're talking about. So when we're looking at skinny versus fat, a lot of people think that, as long as they're skinny, as long as they're at their ideal body weight, that they're healthy, and that being thin is the sole indicator of health. Now, it can definitely reduce some symptoms that are associated with obesity, but there is this false sense of security that we automatically think if we're at our ideal body weight, maybe we won't get type 2 diabetes. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't understand. I have type 2 diabetes, or I'm pre-diabetic, and I'm only 10 pounds from my ideal body weight. So certainly type 2 diabetes isn't related to just obesity, or is it? So do only fat people get diabetes? No, we know that's not true. But the key point I want to make in this video is that diabetes is associated with excess fats. They get into circulation, and this can affect somebody who's at their ideal body weight. So let's talk about exactly what skinny fat is by definition. So it's used to describe anyone who appears lean but has a higher body fat than lean muscle tissue. So when I say lean and I say somebody who's thin, there's two different things. Lean can mean that you have a lower body fat, and thin can mean that you're just weighing less or you're at your ideal body weight. In other words, a skinny fat person can be at their ideal body weight and have a higher percentage of fat and be really at risk for many chronic diseases associated with obesity. Which is why I felt like this video was so important, because we want to really talk about fat in relationship to a composition, body composition, more so than fat related to just being overweight. So what causes this skinny fat? Well, there's several things that will take you right down that road. Prolonged fasting, and that's because you're eating away at muscle tissue. Sedentary lifestyle, because you're not building muscle tissue. An unbalanced diet. Excess fats and sugars can contribute to this. Inadequate protein, because muscles need protein, and when muscles don't get protein, inevitably you could be eating your own muscle tissue for that protein. Excess dietary fat and processed foods are also highly linked, especially if you're pre-diabetic. So being at your ideal body weight is definitely not any type of safety guarantee. So let's talk about what happens with a skinny fat. And I think this visual of marbled fat meat is a perfect example, because we can actually see the marbling in the piece of meat, and we can actually see the fat outside the marbled meat. And so with humans, it's pretty much the same thing. We've got a situation where we can have subcutaneous fat, so we have this fat building outside the muscle. And that's what we typically see when we think of somebody who's overweight. But what we don't see is the fat that's marbled inside the muscle, which is more what the skinny fat person is. That they can inevitably have a situation, maybe they don't have a lot of subcutaneous fat, but the muscle itself is marbled with fat. And this can lead to a higher percentage of body fat to lean muscle tissue. Because once you start marbling this muscle, then what can happen is that percentage of fat can really take away from your total body composition and being healthy. And it can put you at risk for these metabolic diseases, specifically insulin resistance, which is the precursor to type 2 diabetes. And also want to mention type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's, a form of cognitive decline. So all of this is related to body fat, but not necessarily being overweight. So skinny fat is more fat in the muscle than outside the muscle. And typically how it works, and we'll give some really good examples, is when you're sedentary or maybe you're doing a lot of fasting. I'm talking about prolonged fasting, not the 12-hour typical fast in the nighttime, because that's when your body is going to be at a lower metabolic burn. So it's okay if you're going to do a 12-hour fast from 8 o'clock p.m. till 8 a.m. But when those fasts start being prolonged, especially during the day, 16-hour fast or 24-hour fast, what can happen is your body will start eating away muscle tissue to feed the other cells, because protein is what empowers the body to create all these cells, enzymes, everything is made from protein. So if you don't get enough protein from your diet within a 24-hour period, we know for sure you start metabolizing protein tissue. But for some people who are active, it could happen as soon as 16 or 18 hours. So we don't want to skimp on the protein, because we don't want our body to eat muscle tissue to supply cells with needed amino acids to build other things. So bottom line, with a skinny fat person, what I see in my practice is a lot of these chronic dieters, people that are really struggling to maintain their ideal body weight. They're counting their calories and they're not eating adequate protein, and they're slowly eating away at the mass they have. Now, they don't get the subcutaneous fat because they're really watching that diet and making sure they're not overeating, but because they're not eating correctly, they could be still gaining a lot of body fat at their ideal body weight. So let's talk about ideal body weight, because a lot of times people don't know exactly what their ideal body weight should be. So I use an easy formula. And for females, for every inch over 5 feet, you're going to add 5 pounds to a 100-pound base. And for men, for every inch over 5 feet, it's going to be 6 pounds, and you're going to add it to 106-pound base. So I use the example of a female who's 5'4" and a male who's 5'10". So let's just do the easy math so everybody has it. So if you have a female who is, let's say, 5'4", that's going to be 4 inches over 5 feet. And 4 times 5 is 20 plus 100 pounds. So we've got an ideal body weight of 120. And you can easily add 10, and in some cases for larger frames, as much as 15 pounds on top of this, and still be within the safety margin of what ideal body weight is. So you can maybe be 10 or 15 pounds over your ideal body weight, still considered at your ideal body weight by most standards, but have a category of obesity. And in other words, a lot of marbling in the muscle, which is going to put you at risk for a lot of chronic inflammation and also obesity-related diseases like type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance. And for a male, we'll just run that one through so that we have both of them. So for male, we'll take an example. Let me bring my pen back up. We'll take the example of a male that is 5'10". That gives us 10 inches above 5 feet. And 10 times 6 is 60 plus 106. So you've got a male who's 5'10", at an ideal body weight of 166. And again, we can easily add 10 pounds. It's 176, maybe 180. And they're still considered within their normal range for their body weight. Has nothing to do with body fat. Body weight. So when we're looking at what it means to have an ideal body weight, maybe even be at your BMI for what your doctor would say, wow, you're perfect, but you could have a body fat of obese category. And I use this example, and just to give you a range for women, normal level of body fat's 28% or less, and body fat for obesity is anywhere from a 32 to a 35%. So if your body fat percentage is 32 to 35, that's going to put you in the category of obese. And what does that mean? Obesity means that you are at risk for obesity-related diseases, which, top of the list, is type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's. All of these are going to be more prevalent for Mary than for Sandy. And this is where it can get a little confusing. So Sandy, they're both the same height. She weighs 170 pounds, but she's very active, and her body fat is maybe just a little bit over her normal level. Ideally, we'd want her a little less if she was active, but she's still not in the obese category. But Mary, who's at her ideal body weight, she's 5'4", she weighs 130 pounds. Certainly her doctor would say, Mary, you are perfect. Even her BMI is showing in the healthy category. But she is in the obese category. Sandy, her BMI is actually even showing obese. BMI, body mass index, I'm not going to go over in this video because I want to stick with the body fat percentage. Don't want to confuse the two. But that just means the amount of mass versus muscle and fat and bone. So Sandy could have a lot more muscle mass. She's showing a higher body mass index. She's showing a higher weight. But the real indicator for what's going to lead to the association with these chronic metabolic diseases is going to be in fat, the body fat. So what we have with Sandy is we have a highly muscular female with some subcutaneous fat on the outside of the muscle. And let me just kind of go back to this because I forgot to explain to you, typically when you do become more fit or exercising, your body first leans out the muscle. So even if you have subcutaneous fat on top of this muscle, your body is busy getting rid of the marbling within the muscle. So the body wants to get rid of all this marbling because after all, the body needs a muscle that's full of muscle fibers and not fat. So logically, the body would start to get rid of the marbling first, which means inside the muscle, we would start to clean that out. And then eventually the body would start to work on the subcutaneous fat. Or maybe not eventually. Maybe Sandy just needs to have a better diet to help her maybe lose that extra subcutaneous fat. But the point I'm making here is that we have Sandy, who's very muscular, fit, with a small amount of fat on top of the muscle. So of course she looks fatter, she looks bigger, but actually she's at less risk than Mary. Some other examples, we have Paul. And Paul, 150 pounds, his BMI is considered normal. His body fat, though, is at 28%. Now, the big thing with Paul that we'll see a lot when we're looking at insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes for people at their ideal body weight. I'm talking my ideal body weight individuals that, maybe they're 10 pounds, 15 pounds over their ideal body weight, but they're getting the belly. This is a visceral fat, and in this area is where we typically see ideal body weight individuals with prediabetes, because the visceral fat is clearly a sign. You can have little legs, little arms, but this right here is an indicator. And we're going to see it with elevated body fat, not necessarily with elevated body weight or even BMI. So a doctor would look at Paul in the before picture and probably not even be concerned in the least bit. And this may not even show up in his laboratory values. His A1C may even be low because maybe Paul is active. So he's burning some of those sugars. But now we look at Paul after he starts an exercise program, and he's actually 15 pounds heavier. Yet his body fat percentage is much lower. So he went out of the obese category and he gained weight to do it, and his body mass index increased. So when our doctors are trying to decide if we're at risk for some of these chronic inflammations from obesity, sometimes they're not looking at the best markers because they're looking at the weight and they're looking at the BMI, when really they're missing the biggest risk at all, which is the body fat percentage. So just to kind of give you some examples, this is an example of some heavy lean people. And I say heavy lean. Perfect example. This is another Sandy that has muscle that's really fit, hard as a rock. She's fit, but she's got a little bit of fat that outlines the outside of that. So it's misleading. Just to kind of give you some examples, and these, I see a lot of patients, and I get a lot of body fat percentages. I'm pretty good at looking some of the data, and we may not be able to tell if this person here is really lean, but we know, let's say they're exercising, they lift weights, they're active. Now, they're not in the obese category, 31%. We still want them to lose weight, don't get me wrong, but they're not at a high risk. When we look at this percentage of body fat at 27, they're definitely out of the risk category. We'd definitely want to have that a little lower because most athletes, we want them probably closer in the 20 or 23 range. We just know that for women, as long as you're under 28%, that's considered a good body fat percent. If you're active, ideally a little less. So here we have a body fat of 23%, and you can see there maybe she has 5 pounds on her at the most that she could lose, but she's definitely at a good fat percentage. We look below, this person here, she's exercising, she's obviously fairly fit, but the body fat percent is still out of the high risk zone, and she's at less risk than Mary, who was at her ideal body weight, sedentary, chronic dieter, prolonged fasting, eating away muscle, and all Mary's worried about is making sure that number on the scale doesn't tip. So that's the big takeaway I wanted to really bring home with this video. Also, when we're looking at a person who's maybe, and I see with my patients, I'm talking somebody who's maybe 10, 12, 13, 15, no more than 15 pounds above their ideal body weight. And when I get them on my in-body machine that actually measures their percentage of fat, in many cases, I can see that they're anywhere from 32 to 40%. And typically, they don't look fat to most people. Now, they could have a little excess belly fat, and we might see a little more fat in the thigh area, but honestly, we might see the cottage cheese, but in clothes, they look fantastic. And their BMI can be normal. They're only 10 pounds above their ideal body weight, but they're in the obese category. And I think another example is we can have a heavy lean body weight, and this is a guy who's got that little extra subcutaneous fat sitting on top of all this muscle. Same body weight, but a whole different body look. Now, this individual here, we know, wouldn't be looking quite this good if he was doing all-day fasting. In fact, a lot of bodybuilders or people that are really into fitness, the last thing they're doing is fasting all day because they're not worried about losing weight. They're trying to up their body size. They're trying to get more mass. They're really preoccupied with eating more, especially making sure they get adequate protein. So for a heavier body weight that has more muscle, and we can see that they weigh the same, right? But totally different composition. When we're looking at other examples, the opposite would be a skinny fat. Now, we're looking here in her skivvies, but if she had clothes on, she'd probably look just fine. Maybe she'd even look lean. Maybe she'd even look super thin. But ideally, this is the example of a chronic dieter, probably low protein, not getting the right amount of protein they need. Maybe they're fasting 16 to 24 hours because, they're so sure that this fasting is going to be the magic bus ride to maintaining their ideal body weight. They're sedentary, so they're not building muscle. And they're usually only within 10 pounds of their ideal body weight. I've even seen people below their ideal body weight and have a high percentage of body fat. So what is this all about? Well, obesity-related diseases such as type 2 diabetes and insulin resistant have to do with lipid toxicity, which means just fat. Lipid is just a medical term for fat toxicity. And excess fat can happen in overweight people and people at their ideal weight. Excess fat in overweight people, well, they're going to have subcutaneous fat. They're going to have the fat sitting outside the muscle. They're going to have a visceral fat. They're going to have a belly fat in the midsection. And they're also going to have the marbling fat, especially if they're not exercising. So an excess fat in overweight, and this is typically what we're used to seeing, but we can also have excess fat in ideal weight. So you're going to see the visceral fat in the midsection. Maybe we're just getting a little more a muffin top than what we would like. And then also the marble fat. That's the intramuscular fat that we really can't see, but it's there. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this intramuscular fat and its relationship with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. Lipid toxicity, fat toxicity, has to do with excess fatty acids that get into circulation and begin to accumulate in non-fat tissue. And the largest amount of non-fat tissue you have in your body is muscle tissue. So, lipid toxicity, which is the main culprit, fat toxicity, the main culprit for type 2 diabetes, is either from excess dietary fats and dietary sugars, you're just eating too much doggone food, processed foods, or you're eating too much dietary fats. This can contribute to this fat toxicity, or you have a lot of body fat and you're releasing a lot of these fatty acids from your fat cells. Either or even both, these begin to accumulate in the muscle cells, and this is the main culprit for type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, excess fatty acids. And you can have excess body fat, as I was showing you, and still be at your ideal body weight. Because body fat doesn't just come in size, it comes in marbling. So when we look further, there's many, once you know this information, you get on the internet and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing things that I didn't really understand before, but it's kind of making more sense now. So this is from the Diabetes in UK, and they talk about skinny type 2 diabetes. In the highlighted area, they're taking a look at some of the contributing factors behind what they call skinny type 2 diabetes. And they refer to it as thin outside and fat inside. And in the highlighted area, they're mentioning visceral fat stored within our abdominal cavity, which is in the midsection, is associated with health conditions including type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. The term thin outside, fat inside, TOFI, is attributed to individuals who do not look overweight but have a disproportional high amount of abdominal fat, which again is part of the skinny fat population. So someone with thin outside, fat inside has less subcutaneous fat, but large amounts of visceral fat. And also I want to mention as well, they don't mention it here, but they also have a lot of fat marbling, which goes along with both. So let's look at some more studies regarding these fatty acids and their role in type 2 diabetes. In this study, and in the highlighted area, it reads, however, recent studies suggest that lipid changes, which is another word for fat, may not only be consequence of impaired glucose metabolism, in other words, that's part of diabetes. We're saying that excess fatty acids contribute to an impaired glucose metabolism. And it is, here they talk about a causative factor from fatty acids that are influencing this glucose transporter in the muscle. This is what's causing type 2 diabetes. And in the bottom line highlighted area, it says right there that fatty acids may have an essential role in the development of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And you can have excess body fat, a release of excess fatty acids, and be at your ideal body weight and compound that with a high-fat diet. Because so many people that are living at their ideal body weight have misconceptions how to eat. They don't understand the significance of protein, fiber, carbs, and fat, and how these macronutrients need to be timed and in correct ratios, not only at meals, but for the day. And when you're eating a diet of excess fat, you can have excess fatty acids. So you could be your ideal body weight, eating a high-fat diet, not exercising, have a high percentage of body fat. Your doctor's looking at you, giving you the thumbs up because you appear to be at your ideal body weight and your BMI is perfect, and you can be obese. And then, of course, 5 years later, you're pre-diabetic, everybody's confused, and everybody's saying, well, we don't know. But people who, you don't have to be fat to get diabetes. We see people at their ideal body weight and they have diabetes. So it certainly doesn't have anything to do with being fat. And this has not been the case that I have found with my patients at all. In fact, the science shows that yes, fat plays a role in type 2 diabetes. The only thing is you don't have to be fat from the standpoint of too many pounds above your ideal body weight to be there. In this study, it shows the name of the study, skeletal muscle, lipid disposition, insulin resistance, and the effect of dietary fatty acids and exercise. And what they're talking about here, again, is that the lipid toxicity, which is the fat excess in the form of fatty acids, and the uptake into the muscle tissue. And this increases the risk of insulin resistance. In the highlighted area in the study, mounting evidence indicates that elevated intramuscular, which is these fats within the muscle, are associated with diminished insulin sensitivity. In other words, it's not good at determining the insulin's action on the muscle to let the sugar in. So it's diminished insulin sensitivity in skeletal muscle. This lipid accumulation is most likely due to an enhanced fatty acid uptake into the muscle. Right there, they're telling you the story. And the bottom highlighted area, for most of the human population, this is avoidable. Amen. Sure is. Given the causes of the intramuscular lipid excess in the muscle, and I want to say excess because it isn't just going on a total fat-free diet. It's knowing that when you're doing these excess fats, even healthy fats, a lot of nuts, these seed oils at high levels, these are not even high levels, just excess amount of seed oils that are in everything, right? Chips. These contribute to this lipid, this fat toxicity. And you can be at your ideal body weight and become at risk. So diet does make definitely a big impact. And in this study, The name of the study, lipid accumulation in non-adipose tissue and lipid toxicity. So non-adipose means non-fat tissue. Adipose is your fat cells, and they're saying that you can have fat accumulating in cells other than your fat cells. And it says right here, in skeletal muscle and liver, lipid accumulation has been associated with the development of insulin resistance and an early hallmark of developing type 2 diabetes. The highlighted area at the bottom, comments, reports. Finally, accumulation of fat in the heart has been associated with cardiac dysfunction and heart failure, which is an explanation with a lot of association with cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Big association there. So when we get down to it, what's the culprit? Excess fat. Taken together, we conclude that evidence and the effects of these lipid accumulation in non-adipose tissue, which they refer to as lipid toxicity, is strong. And they're saying, obviously, we need more data, but there is enough here in this study to show that this accumulation that's taking place in this muscle tissue, this lipid accumulation, is the hallmark for type 2 diabetes, the risk factor. The other thing in this study talks about visceral adipose tissue. Because when you have insulin resistance, you're going to have that muffin top. You can be a skinny, fat person, and this is also going to be more prevalent for you as well. And a lot of my skinny fats, they're like, oh my gosh, I look great everywhere, but how do I get rid of this belly? Well, this is definitely a hallmark of type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, insulin resistance. And a lot of times they're doing the direct opposite of what they should be. They're cutting out their carbs. They're doing a lot of fasting, long fasts. They're trying to do starvation to some degree. And they're really contributing to more problems. So, bottom line, how can I fix skinny fat? The most efficient, sustainable way to fix skinny fat is building a better body composition, which means you're increasing your muscle mass and you're decreasing your overall body fat. But I want to really highlight some key points, because even when I have patients that are in the gym and they're lifting, but they're not following other lifestyle changes, we can still see the effect of a skinny fat. For example, you got to get adequate protein for the day. You got to reduce the high-fat diets and the processed sugars. Include some type of weight training, obviously more activity. Reduce all-day fasting. I'm not a proponent of it. And if you're going to fast, I say the safest fast, which will have the less problems with muscle atrophy, is going to be your overnight fast, the 8 p.m. to the 8 a.m. Not a problem there, but not what you want to do during the day. Conclusion, overall, addressing the issue of skinny fat is a journey that involves building muscle, reducing excess dietary fats and obviously body fat. Prolonged fasting, not a good idea. And obviously making sure you get adequate protein. So hopefully this helped. And those of you that are in that skinny fat category, let's get out there. Let's start moving. Let's eat a balanced diet. Bring in that protein. And hopefully this has made an impact in your life. And I'm looking in the chat. Sam, how we doing there? Any questions?
No, not today, but just, the
Okay.
usual.
Yeah, like, subscribe. If you have anything topic you want me to go over, let me know. Love to do it. Until next week, have a great week. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.